that. Oh, shit.
That I heard.
Okay, now can you hear me? Yes. Right. This is the interview with our long overdue guest of honor, Tim Powers, and I'm going to give Tim as much of the space as I can, and some time for people in the audience to talk as well. But some of you, I have a brief announcement to start with. Some of you may have caught a tweet this morning from a former Clarion student. Many former Clarion students are here. A writer calling herself Nowell Hopkinson, who did not get her tribute into the program book, but it will be available on the Readercon website, so you can read Nowell's tribute. But just to embarrass him a little bit more, there's one quick passage from this that I want to read, which can lead into my first question.
Oh, shucks.
Yeah. It's talking about a novel many of you know, Last Call. And I want to find out, first of all, if this is a true story, because if it's not, Nowell's in trouble. For Last Call, Tim came up with a magical system based on divinatory tarot cards. He created a gambling game based on the tarot. The loser's soul or consciousness would become unseated from his body and lost forever, tumbling in a void. Some of my fellow Clarionites had done their research on Tim and discovered that A, had been careful to make the game one that could actually be played, though he'd never tried it, and B, he was quite spooked by tarot cards. Really? I'm not done yet, though. It's true so far. So, of course, one of us had a deck of tarot cards, so we learned the game and decided that on the first day Tim met us all, he would come upon us playing. It worked beautifully. The Sunday that Tim arrived, he bounded up the stairs to the student common room to introduce himself. Cheerfully, he asked what we were doing. Then he saw the tarot cards in our hands. He realized it was his game. It was so gratifying to watch him circle the table anxiously from player to player, half curious to see whether the game rules actually worked, and just a little bit afraid that they might work too well.
As a matter of fact, I hate her sentence. Of course, one of us had a deck of tarot cards. But yeah, I went up there and, hi kids, what are you doing? And there they were with all the tarot cards laid out, apparently in use, you know, in action. And they said, you want to sit in? We can deal you in. And I said, no, I'm leaving the building. My attitude toward tarot cards, Ouija boards, I Ching, all of those things is I'm totally skeptical. I think it's all nonsense, and I'm scared of it.
And you really want to save your Clarion students from participating?
Well, it was their call. But for that book, I did have to buy a deck of the Rider-Waite tarot cards in which each card has a little picture on it, because I needed, for the sake of the book, to be able to look at the pictures. But I made sure never to shuffle.
So that's why it leads into my first question, and my first question is going to be broadly, why do you make so much work for yourself? Any number of writers can talk about card games that they invent, but they don't have to actually work. And you go through all the, and this is related to the research. I actually had a story to tell me that in almost every novel you've done enough research for a dissertation.
I've misdirected my efforts, yeah. Well, I do, above all, I'm real aware that with a fantasy novel, at core, if you give the reader a moment to think, they're going to remember that this is all nonsense. It's completely baseless fraud. And so I want to constantly try to trick the reader into forgetting that. And so I want to very thoroughly shore the story up with lots of real-world details, you know, Bic lighters, 7-Eleven Slurpees, so that the reader ideally will think, oh yeah, I know that, I live in this place, I know this world. And then when I spring genies or vampires or something on them, I want them to be appropriately shocked. I don't want there to be any feeling from the beginning of once upon a time. So I want to make sure it's not in any way an alternate Las Vegas, Los Angeles, Vienna. I want to kind of insist, no, this is our Los Angeles. This is the real one. Relax, so that they'll be relaxed when the genies appear.
Well, it's not just the contemporary settings, though. It's the historical settings that require so much research that you're, in a sense, trapping yourself. Well, it's reading one of your novels in some ways is like reading a sonnet, because you're giving yourself so many rules that you can't break. And there's an essay in this wonderful book, this bibliography that John Rowland did called Secret Histories, an essay by China Mieville, in which he describes in intricate detail why the Anuba skates cannot work. Why you set up so many limits to yourself that there's a historical record to begin with, and then you write an incredibly convincing phantasmagoria of things that didn't happen. Well, both at the same time. But you have to end up with the same historical record you started with.
Yeah, I do always take it as a rule when writing historical stuff, whether it's about, I don't know, say Hemingway or Lord Byron or Charlemagne, whatever, that you not change the established calendar. You're not allowed to omit a month just because it would be convenient for the plot to omit a month. And you're not allowed to have the characters fail to be somewhere that history said they were. It is restrictive. It's sort of like the lines of a tennis court. I find it's real useful to have the restrictions. For one thing, I never approach a story with a story in mind. Like, I'm going to write a story in which Lord Byron does this or that. Instead, I do the research looking for things that are too cool not to use, which you always find. And eventually, once I've got 20 or 30 things that by definition are too cool not to put in the book, I've got 20 or 30 pieces of my book. And the task is simply connect the dots. And as I said in an earlier panel, this saves the necessity of having imagination. You don't need imagination, you just need to be able to recognize things that are too cool not to use in the research. And given that, I don't look at them as limitations when I come across these facts in history. They're what it's made of. There was no story to begin with. The story entirely is a result of what I find in the research.
But the story is as convincing as a narrative as the actual historical record. You want to explain the behavior of the romantic poets. Maybe they were actually Lamia bothering them. And that explains their behavior as well as what we suspect was the cause of their behavior.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, it always happens, I come up with some supernatural secret explanation for what Einstein was doing in Pasadena or something. And I'll try to make it consistent, try to make it fit with all the things he really did do. And always late at night, I'll have some last bit of research, some last book, and read it, and it will entirely confirm my theory. And then I think, oh my God, you're not making this up. You're discovering what Einstein was really up to, and it had to do with time machines. And then somehow I'm always convinced that the CIA or the NSA has been monitoring my research, and now there's a guy in the backyard with a sniper rifle lining my head up. But then I go to bed, I'm okay in the morning. But yeah, you approach this with a kind of honorary paranoid schizophrenic squint. You say, okay, I'm going to read this biography of Beatrix Potter, say. But I'm going to be watching for the clues that I know will be there, that she was actually involved in big supernatural stuff. And if you approach it with that admittedly irrational squint, you find it. I mean, anybody. I think I mentioned in a panel earlier that I read that Edison's last project was to be a phone to talk to dead people with. I think, okay. There's a bit I don't need imagination to come up with. Later I found that Edison's last breath was caught in a test tube with a cork. I've seen it. It's in Dearborn, Michigan. Apparently, Henry Ford was an old friend of the family, and he told Edison's kids, "Look, I know your dad's dying, and that's really sad and all, but he's an old friend of mine. I've got this test tube and cork. I don't mean to put you in any trouble, Asher, but when he breathes his last breath, could you just like cork it up for me?" And I picture them, okay. And so they obediently did. They went into Edison's deathbed, and the old man's there, and they're here with the funeral. And finally I picture him, and they start to walk away, and he goes, But when history gives you details like this, really, and if you look closely enough, it always does. Really, the trick is simply connect the dots. And so, yeah, you're not tempted to alter the history. It's working so well.
Well, the phrase that's usually used is, and again, the title of John's book is secret history. I've also heard the term amplified history, in the sense that it's simply adding to history. But you introduced the term paranoid schizophrenia. And connecting the dots can work historically in one way, and it can work in terms of explaining your own life to yourself. This is leading up to your friendship with Philip K. Dick. Because it seemed to me that what Philip K. Dick did was something connecting the dots of his own life in the way that you're connecting the dots of historical events.
Right, I get to quit at 5 p.m.
Well, that's true.
Yeah, well, it's true, yeah, Phil Dick did kind of keep that squint going 24 hours a day, but he was real aware, and of course if you simply read certain of his books or read certain books about him, you decide, wow, he was genuinely mentally ill. But that's inaccurate, because he was aware just as much as I am from 9 to 5 when I'm figuring out what, I don't know, John Philip Sousa was really up to. Phil was always real aware that these speculations were just crazy speculations. Though he would tell us things late at night with a very deadpan expression. I remember one time he convinced Blaylock and I, we were over at his house late with a bottle of wine, and he convinced us that archaeological discoveries in San Diego proved that prehistoric man had one eye and two noses apiece. And he said this very, reluctantly imparting secrets. And these are the Cyclops, and they're very dangerous. And he implied that the world had not seen the last of these creatures. And Blaylock and I went home terrified. That at any turn we were going to see one of these two-nose, one-eyed guys. And I was in college at the time, so I was keeping a journal, of course. And I noted this. And then later in his collected letters, I noticed a letter written a week before he told Blaylock and I this, in which he was deriding this theory, saying it was nonsense, obviously. And I thought, boy, you wouldn't think it was nonsense if you were there that night. I mean, my wife remembers times when Phil Dick would say, my researches have led me to a truth that can be stated in one sentence. This truth has only been known to 8 people throughout history, all of whom died within 24 hours of learning. I want to tell it to you. So yeah, the thing you have to keep in mind with Phil is that his all his wild theological speculations, the Holy Ghost lives retrograde in time and remembers the future, but can't imagine what the past will be. It was all the same sort of, what if, wouldn't this be colorful, I'll tell you something weird, in which, to a large extent, the theories are seized on for their colorful value rather than veracity.
In other words, being a storyteller.
Yeah. If you try to look at him and omit the fact that he wrote very wild science fiction, you've missed a crucial element.
There must have been something going on in Southern California, because there's obviously your relationship with Philip, but also another phrase not my own, which I've heard the Cal State Fullerton Mafia. You and Blaylock and Jeter, I guess, all thinking along the same lines at the same time.
Yeah, we were all young science fiction fans who wanted to write that stuff. And at one point, Jeter heard of the project that would eventually be called Laser Books. People might remember that. It had its virtues.
Probably some in the book group.
Yeah, it had its virtues in being inconvenient and paying very badly. But they were brand new, and they paid very badly, and they had a strict length requirement. Each book had to be exactly 192 pages. And if you were too long, they would cut you, and if you were too short, they'd have somebody around the office write a few new scenes into your book. And the reason for this was they had to be 192 pages so that the shipping cartons would close properly on the right number of books. Obviously, they wouldn't close if you had 194 pages, and if you had 180 pages, they'd rattle around in there. And so this was valuable because they were, my wife argues, but they were pretty indiscriminate. It was certainly easier to get published with Laser than it would have been at the time to get published with Dell, Ace, etc. And since they paid so badly and they were so cavalier in their treatment of manuscripts, like they would send you proofs to correct, and you'd correct them, you know, hours sweating, weeping, and return them, and then they'd throw them in the trash and go with what they had. But since they were so high-handed, all behavior I've encountered from publishers since has seemed comparatively reasonable. I mean, they may be a little annoying, but I think, well, no, on the scale of possibilities, this is really fairly nice.
August Douglas didn't work for them, did he?
No, Roger Elwood.
Roger Elwood set it up. AJ told me a story very much like this, where he was working for some paperback publisher with 109. And one of the things they would not allow was a widow at the top of the page of the chapter.
Yes.
And he may have
meaning the isolated one line.
Right, exactly. And he was editing one of these things. And again, he never sent it back to the author. And the last line of the chapter was, he began to cut. It was a dramatic end to a serial killer story. And it was a widow. He began to cut this one line. So AJ just sort of wrote 3 more paragraphs. Snip, snip, snip. It was a long road. But that was somebody else who influenced you and me as well, I think, early on. I think a vastly underrated writer.
Yeah. Certainly I was, Budrus was one of the writers I read voraciously when I was growing up, and books like Who or Rogue Moon are still, if you haven't read them, they're still as electric as they were when they were first published. And it was daunting for me to first physically meet Budrus. Every time I meet a writer I grew up in awe of, I just lose the ability to speak. I was very lucky when I first met Phil Dick that I had only read one of his books. And so it was a name like John Brunner. I knew the name, but I had not read it. But when I've met Heinlein, Asimov, Leiber, Vonnegut, all I can do is, like, I sweat and spit and I go, man, your books. I'm an idiot. And they wonder who's the little brain damaged guy. When I did this with Vonnegut, I stammered and sweat. Neither of us is enjoying it, but we both know it has to be done. And I had a book of my own, which I signed effusively. Oh my God, oh Mr. Vonnegut, here. And then when my wife and I left, we found the book in a planter outside. And I thought, couldn't you have the courtesy to throw it into a lidded trash can? And now I keep waiting for somebody to come up to me all spitty and sweaty. It hasn't happened yet.
I think it's, this is going to happen to you before you get out of the
I'm
right, exactly. But that's one of the things that's always fascinated me, just looking at what you write, and looking at your background as a stone science fiction reader at Van, a Sturgeon, an Asimov, an Heinlein, and that sort of, you've really only written one science fiction novel.
That's true, that's true. Well, I wouldn't say this if I thought it would go any further.
Stop tweeting.
This isn't being taped, is it? Science fiction is harder. I mean, I love science fiction. I mean, I probably reread 10 Heinlein books in a year accidentally. It just happens. You stumble across them on the floor. But Frederick Cole, good Lord, Stephen Baxter. But I'm always very aware of, I mean, I can do historical research, but I'm always very aware of the depth of just scientific background, not specific research, but just general knowledge that they have. And I think, it's like reading a Dick Francis book. You realize you'll never know as much about horse racing as Dick Francis does. I'll never grasp physics as well as Werner Vinge, Steve Baxter.
But that's hard science fiction. I mean, Sturgeon didn't write hard science fiction.
Very true. Actually, instead of giving a reason why I avoid science fiction, I should give a reason why I do write fantasy.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah. I'm always struck by the fact that, again, some people have heard me say this, but everybody, the most rational, sensible, atheist, materialist person you can imagine, gets spooked by movies like The Ring. I mean, we all know completely rational people who say, I'm going to see that. Say, why not? A dead girl come out of the well, I don't need that guy. You don't think it's true, do you? Of course not. That's nonsense. Then why does it bother you? Well, I don't know, man. And I think I said this at the Cafe Clatch, but I know a lot of people that say, well, I'm not scared of that ghosts and vampire stuff. I don't believe that. I'm responsibly an adult. I'm scared of urban gangs and terrorists. So there. And I think, right, it's noon, there's a lot of people around. Go ahead and say that. But if they were the only person in an old house at 3 a.m. and they heard something dragging downstairs, they're not going to think, I bet that's an urban gang member. They know exactly what it is. It's a werewolf. The thing is, everybody does definitely still have in their heads that circuitry that lights up at hints of, oh my God, the supernatural just is happening. Chesterton said somewhere that when we read a story that says, if you pluck a flower in this garden, a princess will die in a faraway land, part of our head thinks, well, yeah. Before the rational part of our head can slam down and think, what? And so I always want to light up that sort of primitive half of the brain. Since it will light up, I think let's light it up.
And that's where the history of fantasy lies, I suppose. It goes back much further than the history of science fiction. You mentioned Chesterton, for example, who is also, I think, one of the hidden influences of a variety of 20th century fantasy.
And a whole lot of people turn out to be very aware of Chesterton.
Yeah, and well, he'd written one of the classic essays about the rules of fantasy, called ethics of Elfland.
That's right.
And one of the other things that Nella Hawkinson mentioned in her tribute, which you should all look at, was when you were teaching, you were pulling things out, not just from the history of science fiction, not from genre fantasy, not just Fritz Leiber, but people like quoting the Romantic poets, or Swinburne, or John le Carré, or, in other words, this broad reading in literature, which is something I think that some aspiring science fiction and fantasy writers don't realize. It's good to read lots of different things.
Well, certainly, I'm not the first to say it. I think of a Fritz Leiber essay where he emphasizes it. But yeah, certainly, in the interest of doing that one core trick, which is tricking the reader into believing that these are real characters in a real place with real problems, you want to be able to summon as much lumber of plausibility as you can possibly get in your wheelbarrow. And therefore, yeah, John le Carré, Kingsley Amis, Michael Connolly, just so that when that speed bump comes up and the reader has to believe in faster than light travel or ghosts or time machines, you've sort of helped, you've given them some impetus. You're helping them over that speed bump. And so, yeah, poetry certainly is a very good machine for helping at that. And if you can borrow some poetry tricks, the opposite of what I think you need to do, which is get readers to believe, oh my God, these are real people. They have real problems. Look at what's happening. A dead grandmother that's chasing down the road, or whatever it might be. The opposite of getting that effect successfully is tongue-in-cheek, irony, that sort of smirking, winking, as if the author is looking over the top of the manuscript and kind of nudging the reader and winking, like, we both know this is crap, huh? We're just having fun with a bunch of imaginary stuff. I never meant you to believe these are real people. I'm sure we're too smart for that. I hate that. Anytime I'm reading a science fiction fantasy and it begins to take that tone, I think, no, I didn't pay you for this. I paid you to trick me into really caring, into believing these are real people and caring about them. I didn't pay you to work little hand puppets in front of my face. I want my $5 back.
Which is why it's the sort of thing we were talking about.
I don't mean you personally.
But somebody out there might know. Well, it's the same thing we were talking about the other night about killing. Well, George Martin's favorite trick. Well, it's not favorite trick. It's reality. It's killing off characters because they die. And when somebody dies, as he said, you're supposed to feel grief. If you don't feel grief, you haven't felt the character.
Yeah. It's like, I've taught Clarion, I've taught writing, and so I've seen a lot of unpublished, and in fact unpublishable manuscripts. And a lot of times I'll see that something happens, and yeah, nobody appears to be upset.
Right.
And therefore I conclude that, in fact, nothing happened. I always think of, when I'm at my desk, there's always 3 or 4 cats around. And if there's a noise outside, some explosion or backfire or something, scream, the cats look to me. And if I simply keep reading or typing, they relax, they figure it was nothing. But if I leap up in alarm, they begin circling the walls and knocking everything off the shelves. And when I'm reading a story, in order to judge whether something important really happened or not, I watch the way the characters react. And if, like my cats, they just keep sleeping, I figure, oh, nothing happened. But if the characters in the story are appropriately affected, then I think, oh, something did happen. Somebody really did die. And so, yeah, it all has to do with that trick of making the reader think it's real, making the reader think it's happening. Which, of course, the sophisticated postmodern type scholars are correct in saying that it's naive to fall into a story that way, but I am naive in that way. I want to fall into a story that way.
I sometimes wonder if that business of just brushing off death comes from watching too many movies as kids. And in other words, the insensitivity to death is partly due to actors like, Jack Elam, remember him, the Western villain? Because every time you see him, he would be killed in every Western movie back then.
That's right.
But you knew he was going to be in the next Western movie, because he was the bad guy that was always in the movies.
And you knew from the start he was going to die within 20 minutes.
Right. This kind of brings us to another area which is related to the news as well. You know, you've done a lot of, you've pretty much done the 19th century now. I mean, with Hide Me Among the Graves, you can still kind of do early.
There's some middle bits.
By the way, for those of you who don't know this, because it is a novella which is in the Hackdown collection, two of my favorite novels are The Stress of Her Regard and Hide Me Among the Graves, which is the one that deals with the Rossettis. And this guy, Edward John Trelawney, one of these historical figures, is the main figure in a novella called The Time to Cast Away Stones, which is a bridge between The Stress of Her Regard and Hide Me Among the Graves. But Hollywood, you've written a fair amount about Hollywood, and the sort of shadow history of Hollywood, which you seem to know inside and out.
My wife, luckily, is very interested in it and reads it obsessively and tells me bits. She'll say, did you know that, for example, when Rudolph Valentino was dying of peritonitis, he was a good Catholic, and they brought a priest in, and the priest tried to give him last rites, found himself baffled, stymied, had to go away and bring a second priest in, and the two of them together successfully managed to give Valentino the last sacrament. And I told her, no, I didn't know that. Where's that? Show me that. That's neat. And so my wife largely finds these obscure and very intriguing and evocative bits of Hollywood history.
Okay, and so you could work those in.
Then I read the book.
Yeah, you read the book. But then there's also one thing I have to ask you about, which connects Hollywood history with ancient history, which are these spider-like shapes. You just make that up. There are spider-like shapes that you can find back in Aubrey Beardsley paintings, and they show. And
which are, they kind of are in Aubrey Beardsley.
Well, yeah, you can find spider-like things anywhere you look, can't you?
Oh, wait, I'm looking at the rug here. Well, there you actually, I got the idea that what it is there's these creatures who are two-dimensional. So, just like Mr. A Square of Flatland, I've got people who've read that. But where I got the idea of having a mimical species which is two-dimensional was from Cordwainer Smith's The Game of Rat and Dragon. Because it's spacefaring, but the enemy is this, in fact, two-dimensional species. And I found that real fascinating.
Humans see them as dragons, but cats see them as rats.
Right.
That's why you have to have a cat in your space.
Yeah, you have to have a cat with you in a spacecraft. But yeah, as a matter of fact, Cordwainer Smith is a gold mine of implications and directions that suggest great stuff for other stories.
And there was also this implication in his work like yours, that there's a vast untold story behind all this.
Right, yeah. There always has to be, well, if you look through history, you see that was actually a reference to